you for joining us. My name's Daniel Horan, and I am professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology. And I have the distinct privilege of serving as the director of the Center for Spirituality here at St. Mary's College. I'm delighted to welcome you to this second installment of a new series sponsored by the Center for Spirituality titled the Ex Libris Author Lecture Series, which features authors discussing their recent publications on topics related to the mission of the center. Founded in 1984, with the generous support from the Sisters of the Holy Cross, of whom we have many wonderful models and representations with us, the Center for Spirituality offers programs that promote the engagement between faith and reason and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. A hub for scholarly and public engagement, we draw on intellectual resources in the Catholic and Christian heritage, as well as how individuals practice faith in their daily lives to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. Before we proceed with our exciting event this afternoon, we wish to acknowledge that we who are gathered here in person are gathering on sacred land, and we wish to honor the native peoples who have been the traditional custodians of this place for generations. We particularly recognize the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi and the Miami, who have cared for this land and its resources for many generations and continue to do so today. With deep gratitude, we recognize these native peoples and their cultures within our community, as well as acknowledging the land upon which we gather, pray, learn, and work. We also want to welcome all of those who are joining us virtually for this live webinar. You'll have an opportunity, and I'll explain in greater detail in just a moment, in joining in this conversation with your comments and questions. Our format for our program this afternoon is threefold. First, Dr. Corwin will offer a brief presentation about her work. Next, we'll engage in a conversation on the themes of her book. And finally, we will open the floor for questions and comments from the audience, both those gathered here in person and those gathered with us in spirit. Just a reminder that the campus bookstore has copies of Embracing Age available for sale in the lobby. And Dr. Corwin will be around afterward to meet you and gladly sign copies of her book. And we also welcome those who are joining us virtually to purchase the book wherever they can find excellent books, which we'll leave it to you. Dr. Anna Corwin received her PhD from UCLA and is a recipient of fellowships from the National Science Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, for her research on aging and well-being. An associate professor of anthropology at what we here in Indiana like to call the other St. Mary's, that is St. Mary's College of California, Dr. Corwin has spent the last 13 years researching how everyday practices shape individuals' experiences of well-being as we age. Her newest project, funded by the Templeton Foundation, explores perception and enskillment as emergent in interactions with the divine. An author of many peer-reviewed articles, and the book about which we're here to speak and to have a conversation today, Embracing Age, How Catholic Nuns Become Models of Well-Being, are among her many publications. Dr. Corwin's work explores the effects of everyday routines and habits on health and well-being in older age. And it is our wonderful pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Anna Corwin, who will speak to us on her book, Embracing Age, How Catholic Nuns Became Models of Aging Well. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Father Dan and the St. Mary Center for Spirituality for this invitation. Thank you to those of you who are here in person and those of you virtually for spending time with me today. I'm really excited. I'm delighted to be in conversation with you. So I'd like to begin with an invitation. I will invite you to reflect back on the past day or week. Sorry, I'm going to make sure. Are we good? We're good. I'll invite you to reflect back on the past day or week and bring your attention to a moment when you noticed your own body aging. Let's hold this moment and examine it with curiosity. What did you notice? Was your attention brought to a particular part of your body, or the way your body moved in space, or something you were doing, or physical sensation? And what story accompanied this moment? Often, our stories and the cultural systems they illuminate can be invisible to us, and yet our very experiences of our bodies are shaped by the cultural systems that we are embedded in. As a linguistic anthropologist, I'm interested in the systems of meaning that interweave with our attentional practices and the ways in which our bodies become embedded with cultural and moral meanings. My book, Embracing Age, explores how the stories that we tell, that each individual tells about aging and about our bodies, shape our experiences of these bodies, of pain and of illness and of the last stage of life, including death. These cultural and moral meanings are often invisible to us as we move through the world. And yet, the stories we tell are powerful enough to alter our health outcomes. The way we think about our body and the way we talk about our bodies matter. Embracing Age opens with a description of my young daughter squealing with delight when she noticed that she was tall enough to spit her toothpaste into the sink without a stool. For her, this ontogenetic process of growing taller was part of a cultural script she was learning. To be taller meant that she was growing older, and growing older was a delight, an accomplishment to be celebrated. American families and our schools and the media and our houses of worship all celebrate this process of little kids becoming big kids and then adolescents. The stories that my daughter had absorbed about aging imbue her changing body with meaning as she grows older. And as she's on her way to adulthood, she will continue to have a multitude of possible stories with which to interpret her aging body. In the introduction of the book, I also talk about my grandmother, who at the other end of the human lifespan in her 90s had few cultural models to look to. When she saw signs of her body changing, these changes were interpreted through a medical framework of pathology, or the semiotics of decline and endings. The most prevalent cultural model of aging we encounter in the US is often called the successful aging model. It permeates medical, gerontological, and popular discourses. And at first, this might seem like a neutral framework or even a really good framework, right? Who wouldn't want to age successfully? That sounds pretty good. We all want to be successful. But this model can be a problem. It tells us that after individuals reach productive adulthood, that we should aim to grow older without experiencing any correlated bodily changes. In other words, we should age without aging. This ideal paints success or successful old age as a suspended period of unchanged adulthood, marked only by the passing of time. One's success is measured by one's ability to maintain productive, independent activity, free from care and dependence. But as we all know, human bodies do change as the years go by, and the unfortunate corollary of this ageless aging model is that it imagines aging itself to be a problem that individuals are tasked to avoid. And therefore, if one actually ages, one is no longer successful in this model. And this is not only not how human bodies work, it also highlights major social justice issues as social disparities systematically produce health disparities that can impact communities and individuals for generations. In other words, not being able to age successfully, to the extent that avoiding aging is possible for anyone, not doing so, not aging successfully, is also not an individual choice. The cultural narrative of aging in the United States offers what Chimamanda Adichie has called a single story. The final stage of the life course is flattened into a single story told in terms of avoidance and failure. Embracing Age, my book, explores a very different model of aging, and in doing so, I hope to complicate this single story. By exploring how Franciscan sisters in a Midwestern convent experience aging and the end of life, I hope to introduce an opening for all of us to imagine other possibilities. This is one gift that anthropology as a discipline offers, the ability to see what we might have seen as natural or normal or inevitable is in fact one story among many possible stories. This book examines the lives of a community of women religious, Franciscan sisters, a group who's been found to age more successfully than their peers. American sisters in general have, like the sister sitting in front of me, as a group, as a population, of course, have gained notoriety among gerontologists for their successful aging outcomes. The School Sisters of Notre Dame even graced the cover of Time magazine in 2001 as expert agers. Epidemiologists have found that American sisters experience increased longevity, they're physically healthier at the end of life, they have fewer instances of Alzheimer's disease, report higher emotional well-being at the end of life than their peers. They're less impacted by disability or emotional burdens that often come with late life or end of life. Sisters overall are less afraid of death. They maintain physical mobility much longer than their peers. Epidemiologists have found a number of clear factors at play, such as consistent nutrition, higher education, really important elements. And they've also found that there are correlations between the sisters' health outcomes and their social support and prayer practices, areas that David Snowden writes he was not equipped to study with the tools of epidemiology. Anthropology, however, has precisely these tools to address social questions. This research, made possible by the gift the sisters, these Franciscan sisters, gave me of letting me into their lives, allowing me to live with them in their community for over 10 months, offers a very different story of aging than the one my grandmother experienced. In short, I found that the cultural practices of aging in the convent were completely different than this ageless aging or successful aging model. Instead of valuing independence and productivity and avoiding aging, drawing on institutional and theological frameworks, the sisters had robust cultural practices of interdependence. Systems of mutual care emerged in the convent. Instead of striving to avoid aging, the sisters developed a culture in which aging was embraced as a natural part of the life course. And this had profound effects on their well-being as they aged. Pain, decline, and death were understood to be challenging, yes, but they were also framed as opportunities to practice acceptance, to practice meaning-making and connection. I tell the story of how this model of aging emerged and is practiced in two parts. The first half of the book focuses on micro-interactional moments. As a linguistic anthropologist, I'm attuned to the ways that language and interaction both reveal and create cultural meaning. For example, I explore how petitions or intercessory prayers recited daily at Mass and during community prayer included lessons for the sisters who were learning how to age. Most of us are attuned to the ways that little kids learn to be parts of their to be competent members of their communities. They learn their community's languages, they learn their cultural practices and values. But the same phenomenon happens when we age. We learn what aging means in our cultural communities. We teach each other, both explicitly and implicitly, the culturally appropriate ways to be old. In the convent, intercessions, these petitions, were key sites for this socialization to take place. In their petitions, the sisters almost never asked God to intercede directly on a health outcome, on a health issue. For example, a sister would never ask for God to heal a broken bone. Instead, sisters asked for acceptance or grace as a fellow sister encountered a condition or struggled with a health problem. By asking for acceptance or grace, the sisters were demonstrating to their peers that pain or illness was normal and natural, an opportunity to deepen one's connection with the divine and with each other. This is quite different from the messages that my grandmother received, that pain or illness were understood as symbols only of a failing body through a single story of pathology. In the book, I show how everyday interactions like these prayers, but also telling stories or playing card games, also reveal a network of support and engagement. Older sisters are understood to be valued members of their communities, engaged in meaningful action, even after they have experienced chronic conditions that impact their ability to move or speak. These webs of interaction reveal a culture in which aging is positioned as a natural part of the life course, and those who age continue to be integrated in everyday cultural activities rather than segregated from the community. Imagine, this is so different from what most of us see in lay life. Those who are beginning this final stage of their life see their peers declining and see them continue to be engaged in meaningful activity. They see that when they decline, they too will be valued members of a community. In this way, decline and illness may be challenges, but they don't threaten one's inherent personhood. In the second part of the book, I tell the story of larger social structures, exploring institutional, theological, and historical changes in the convent to show how habitual cultural patterns shape the sisters' attunement to the world and their bodies. The sisters who I worked with experienced tremendous institutional change during their lives, spending nearly half their lives before Vatican II and half after. I write, for example, about Sister Teresa, who joined the convent as a 17-year-old in 1944. In the 1960s, she was sent as a missionary to Oceania, where she lived in an isolated village. During this time, she contracted amoebiasis, amoebas that infected her body. But embodying these practices of obedience and humility as they had been taught in the 40s and 50s, this of course has changed. She didn't ask to return to the US for treatment. She simply endured this experience. By the time she returned home, the amoebas had spread through her body so profoundly that the condition was chronic. Over the remaining decades of her life, she endured surgeries to remove parts of her organs where the amoebas had settled. And by the time I met her, she was in her 80s and had had parts of her feet removed, limiting her mobility. However, when I sat with Sister Teresa, the room was infused with joy. Her laughter was tremendous. It was infectious. When she told me the story of these amoebas, she shook her head. And when she used to think that God had sent these amoebas as punishment. She interpreted her suffering through these semiotics of sin. She cursed the amoebas and she prayed to God to take them away and to lift her out of pain. Then her face lit up into a smile, and she told me that a few decades before I'd met her, she was praying and she realized if everything in the world is divine, as she had been taught after Vatican II, if every single creature is not only made by God, but is God, then it seemed only logical to her that the amoebas infecting her body must be God as well. And upon realizing this, she said, I called a meeting of all the amoebas in my body and I apologized. She spoke to them. She said, the same creator made us all. And she told me that now she loved her amoebas as she loved God. And every morning she would address all of God within herself, including these amoebas, in her daily prayer. She said that although she still experienced pain, the pain was not as significant as it had once been. She no longer interpreted the pain as divine punishment, and she began to interpret the pain as a natural part of God's world. And as she did this, the pain decreased. Sister Teresa was not alone in reporting a change in her experience and pain in the decades following Vatican II. These changes correlated with changes in language in the prayer books. As the sisters moved away from prayer books that depicted God as an authority figure looking down on them, or a father figure who was depicted as judging them, they stopped interpreting pain as divine punishment. Following Vatican II, the sisters adopted a Franciscan prayer book which described God, quote, dwelling within them and walking with them. As the language of prayer changed and the larger institutional practices shifted everyday life in the convent, the sisters experienced shifting theological understandings of pain and suffering. Research has shown that the way we interpret pain shapes how it is experienced. As David Morris writes, quote, pain is not blindly felt or reflectively endured as a series of biochemical impulses. It changes with its place in human history. When pain is interpreted through a framework that offers it a positive valence or meaning, pain has been found to be less painful, easier to endure. The opposite is true. Useless, scary, or foreboding pain can be more painful or harder to endure. This is part of the story of the convent. When the sisters did encounter chronic conditions or pain after Vatican II, they had a cultural framework that allowed them to see pain as an opportunity to walk with God. This framework did not make the pain go away, but it lessened its blow. In the book, I aim to show an alternative to the single story of aging we often see in the US. By exploring the nuns' lives, we see a model of aging in which aging is accepted and old age is not stigmatized, it's embraced. The sisters' values of community, interdependence, and meaningful decline reveal themselves in micro-interactional moments. These are values that manifest in the nuns' everyday lives as they pray for the grace to accept what comes, or coordinate a card game with a sister who in old age can no longer speak or move as she once did. These practices, just like the prayers that socialize sisters into particular ways of aging, are simple actions that together shape the sisters' experiences at the end of life. In a society where scientific findings are often translated into seemingly quick fixes, such as eating blueberries every day will improve your heart health, ethnographies provide a different lesson. Rather than isolating single threads that might explain entire social phenomena or health outcomes, anthropological inquiry reveals how interconnected cultural values and ideals are with habitual practices, everyday practices, these small acts that we engage in. While I aim to show that the sisters' experience of aging emerged in a very particular time and place, influenced by a particular moment in the history of the church within the US, with a very particular combination of theological, ideological, and cultural practices, we can all learn how powerful the stories we tell about aging are and how they impact health outcomes and well-being. What I learned in the convent was that the secret to aging was not what most of us might expect. The nuns do not avoid aging. They may be physically healthier for longer and even live longer lives, but ultimately, sisters also age. They do not remain productive, ageless, and independent forever. The sisters' secret was not that they remained ageless. Instead, they invested time and energy into learning how to age gracefully, to accept old age as it came, and in short, embrace aging.
As we're getting settled into part two, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge Sister Teresa and the true Franciscan spirit of calling even amoebas brother and sister amoeba. So
exactly. Yes.
She's definitely living into the charism.
Yes.
Well, Dr. Corwin, thank you so much. I have a lot of questions and a lot of thoughts, and I know that those gathered here do as well as our folks online will, but I get to take the privilege of starting our conversation. And we chatted a bit this afternoon, and I mentioned to you that last weekend I happened to be visiting another university for a meeting. And two colleagues and I over dinner were having a conversation. They were both about 15, in one case, maybe 20 years older than me. And they were sharing and lamenting about the difficulty of attending to their aging parents, these transitions in life, and really struggling with how to care for them and struggling to articulate that. Having recently read your book, one of the things that struck me immediately was how much their aging parents and the rest of their family struggled. They had never directly talked about aging, as you've talked about now. They didn't have the language to describe what was being experienced. So I thought of your book right away, and I did tell them to buy it and read it. They were very interested. And I was reminded of the opening paragraphs in your introduction that you just recounted, about your 98-year-old grandmother and your two children's reactions to her in her advanced age. And the line that came to me in that conversation as I listened to my colleagues is what you said, and I quote, after she raised her children, concluded her career, and retired at 80, nearly 2 decades earlier, there were few clear cultural practices for my grandmother to look to make sense of this stage of her life. And I think it's probably a good place for us to begin. I'm so curious. I was curious at the time and subsequently, and been waiting to ask you, if you were in my shoes at the dinner table, with everything you've learned and experienced and studied, what would you say to these colleagues of mine? What would you say to so many people in the US context who are struggling with this?
That's a great question and a big question. It can be so hard. There's such a stigma around aging. In the lay world, it can be so hard to start these conversations, largely out of politeness strategies. So as a linguistic anthropologist, I'm thinking about that. There's all these, if aging itself is bad, then in this context, then talking about it or admitting that someone is aging is almost an insult. And so we do these politeness things in our families, in these conversations where we don't admit, we say things like, oh, you don't look a year over 60, as if it's a compliment. But of course, embedded in that compliment or embedded in that politeness, we are rehashing and recreating this stigma around aging. And so what do we do about that? I think in the US, we have made there's a huge history. The hospice movement is a huge, has been amazing. And I think that we have made progress in terms of looking at death in some ways, looking at palliative care and death there have been just beautiful examples of, I think Atul Gawande might be a great example of this. Public figures, really opening us up to these conversations. But I would say I think this needs to start much, much earlier. Ashton Applewhite has a popular book about aging, where she I think offers lay folks a real opening. But I think we have to begin to talk about aging as if it is natural, as if it is part of the life course, and just open up these conversations. And I would say in my experience, older adults are like my grandmother. I've spent some time running some workshops and working in a retirement community near my home. I would say older adults are much more open to this than many younger folks give them credit for. And so I don't know if I think we just need to start talking.
I think that's very, very helpful. And I know we're going to circle back to some of the conclusions. You've left us hanging about, what next? What's the big takeaway? So stay tuned. I shared this with you earlier, so I'm not putting you on the spot, but for those who haven't yet read Dr. Corwin's book, she is an extraordinary narrator, not only an excellent scholar, an excellent and rigorous anthropologist, but a great storyteller. And you set scenes in a very captivating way. And as I shared with you, I have to admit that there was one narrative in particular that was really deeply moving. I feel myself getting choked up a little bit. So I hope I'm not setting expectations too high. And it's the story of the sister you name Sister Irma, and her simple, profound, quiet, and I imagine until you put it in print, largely unknown ministry outside of the community of the ministry she offers to her fellow sisters every day. The scene's beautiful. And I already asked Dr. Corwin if she'd be willing to read the scene to us so we can hear it in your own voice. It's just 3 paragraphs, but it's the opening of chapter 3. And then we can talk about it.
Okay. Okay, so this chapter is called Talking to God. It was 2 p.m. on a hot July afternoon. The convent outside was abuzz with life. The sticky, humid air hummed with insects and birds. Inside the great brick convent walls, I followed Sister Irma down the hallway. At 80, she walked with a slight limp. She had a thick apron tied around her waist and held a bottle of lotion in one hand. Inside the infirmary, the air was so cool that I began to feel goosebumps develop on my forearms. I followed Sister Irma into room after room. The afternoon light streamed in the windows, and she greeted each of her elderly peers with a hello that was often followed by a playful tease or joke. She then sat down to offer each sister a foot massage. Every day since she had retired from a lifetime of teaching and working in a rural parish, Sister Irma had spent her afternoons like this, walking down the infirmary hallways and massaging the feet of her elderly sisters. As she massaged, the nuns gabbed, reminiscing about the past, gossiping about who was doing what, and checking in on what each of them had been up to that week. In one of the rooms, under a handmade yellow and brown Afghan, one sister reclined on a medical bed with her eyes closed. She moaned quietly and made no indication that she was aware of our presence next to her bed. Sister Irma cupped the sister's knobby hand in her warm palms and introduced me to Sister Dominique. She then drew the sign of the cross on Sister Dominique's forehead and said to her, "Thank you for your prayers. Your family and our community are grateful for your prayers." She softly, lay down Sister Dominique's hand on top of the Afghan, and we moved on down the hallway.
Thank you. So maybe a first question would be, as a linguistic anthropologist, what do you make of that encounter? You narrate it so well, so beautifully. What was your experience of that?
This was, it was beautiful to witness. It was a gift to witness. And this was a consistent practice that Sister Irma, she would go in and she would, this ministry that she did, she went into every sister's room, whether or not they could recognize her, as we see. And, I just was speaking about this model that we have in which in the US, we imagine little kids as on their way to potentially being valuable persons, right? In that they will become, what are you going to be when you grow up is sort of the big question. And we imagine productivity and contribution as so important. And sisters, do so much work. They do so much service, so many lives, and depend on this work. So it's not as if sisters aren't productive citizens. They do incredible amounts of work. And so that moment of retirement can be really hard. Even though they're in this community that I describe as embracing age, that those couple of years, just like in the lay world where identity is changing, I've been serving all my life. Who am I without this service? Who am I when I can't serve? And then at this next stage that we see Sister Irma with here, who am I when I can't talk, when I can't move, when I can't understand what you're saying, when I forget who you are? These can be devastating if this is, for how we identify. And so what this ministry that she does is so beautiful. As a linguistic anthropologist, one of the things that I see her doing in this moment is reflecting back to the sisters this value of being, this value that is so theologically sound, this idea that any human is valuable just as they are. But yet we rarely feel that, especially in the US in this capitalist society. And so by reminding the sisters, Thank you for your prayers. And this reminder, just your living, just your breathing in this moment is a prayer. It's a beautiful reframing of their value and showing it to them and to any other witness who is there.
You talk a lot about prayer. You mentioned as one example in your presentation, the role of intercessory prayer. And I can't help but think about how significant for the local community here at St. Mary's, more particularly with the Sisters of the Holy Cross at the Loretto worship community, particularly during the pandemic when worship services were moved entirely online, how intercessory prayer grew into an experience of solidarity and communion and transformation, and has continued as the community has moved back into worshiping together on Sunday in person. And in this experience with Sister Irma and her ministry, that's a ministry of prayer, a ministry of connection, a ministry of human dignity, as you were describing it, raises questions for me, your perspective on what is prayer. I think we chatted a bit about the struggle of anthropologists over history, how do we make sense of this? How do I analyze this? How do I contextualize this? And so I suppose maybe one way to ask the question is, how would you have described prayer before this research? And how do you understand prayer now after all that time with this community?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think before I did this research, I think I understood prayer as an interaction between an individual and God, and asking God for something or to do something, or perhaps saying thank you to God, all these different ways that one communicates with God, with the hope that God then might have an action in the world. And of course, like you're foreshadowing, prayer has so much more in it, so many more social functions. That's a huge social function. That's really important, that communion with God, that communication. But it also, one of the things I noticed as I was in the convent was there kept being these prayers that had a lot more details than God needed. if one takes God to be omniscient. And so there would be these prayers like for Sister so-and-so on the third floor who just got home from this hospital. And so as I was in the convent witnessing these prayers, I began wondering, so what are those for? There's this theory, this theorist called, his last name is Grice, called Grice's maxims. And the idea is usually we don't provide more information than the interlocutor we're speaking with needs. It's actually impolite to do that. So if I were to give you directions and just tell you Indiana is situated in the United States and it's, that would be rude, right? To give too much information. And so I was thinking about Grice's maxims. And of course, and then I started to notice after those prayers, sisters would go to the room on the third floor. And so there was this social function where prayers were communicating also to the community. And as you mentioned, can hold space for, I don't know, I'm losing my words, but for healing. For community to come together and to be in relationship with each other as well, not just in relationship with the divine.
It's so insightful. And the way you describe, on the one hand, I was thinking, well, maybe this is a version of like human splaining to God, the rudeness of, right. Our creatureliness, and like we're telling God what God clearly knows. But also the beauty of actually that's a social signaling to the fellow sisters. There's a horizontal dimension to it.
Exactly.
And it's got me thinking about, and hopefully you didn't experience this in your setting, as somebody who's a liturgical presider in my own tradition as a Roman Catholic, there's always a dangerous fine line you have to walk when you open up spontaneous intercessory prayer, because on occasion, I hate to say this, but people can use those intercessory prayers as kind of a battle or an insult. So somebody will pray for this intention and somebody prays for the opposite intention. And it's like this side, that side sort of thing. So the many layers of prayer. I guess just one follow-up question about prayer that's been on my mind. I was thinking in your presentation, and I was thinking about my colleagues. I don't know what their aging parents' faith tradition is, if they identify one at all. You've used the language of kind of lay and religious, which fits very well, I think, in the Catholic context. But those who are not religious, who may not, and I mean professed religious
Right.
sisters or brothers or priests,
Mm.
but are also not of a religious tradition or an identified spiritual tradition. Is there does that create a problem? If you're a pure humanist, secularist, and all you have is successful aging models, what can these sisters show them?
Yeah, I try to speak to that in the book, and especially in the conclusion. I try to translate. I'm trying to do two things in the book, which is really show the depth and particularity of this community and in its what I find really beautiful practices, but also look at how others can learn. I'm Jewish. I come from a Reformed tradition, and talking about God is actually, you'd be surprised. Well, maybe you won't be surprised, but it's a lot of Reformed Jews don't talk about God. I find it fascinating as a human. But so I can absolutely even personally relate to this like sort of problem. Prayers can be, I mean, this is sort of a crass way of saying it, but very useful in terms of just social support, caregiving. So what do you do without it? One of the things that I talk about in the book is, well, I guess there's different, we haven't introduced this yet, but I'll introduce it now. One of the things I talk about in the book is this problem, so to speak, of how difficult it can be to interact with people who have chronic conditions such that they cannot communicate, or have profound dementia so that they, don't remember moment to moment can't track a conversation. And often, again, because of our politeness strategies and because of the stigma around aging, we can often have a really hard time entering into these conversations. And prayer served a beautiful role there, because it doesn't, the interaction can be successful no matter what that interlocutor says, right? And so this is where I'm getting into the what about other than prayer. So did storytelling. Storytelling was a beautiful linguistic genre, basically, that I noticed in the convent as something that the sisters used with other sisters in particular who couldn't communicate in typical everyday ways for various reasons. And so they would tell stories or jokes, and would basically, these are two communicative strategies that it would invite in participation but not require a particular response. And I think those are certainly things that can be used anywhere with anyone.
That's such a great answer. And if we had infinite amount of time, I would want to ask you more about another story you tell that involved you directly in an encounter with a sister whose pseudonym I can't recall, but you include the verbatim or something of a verbatim of a non-verbally communicative sister who offers you a blessing. And there's a little bit of a humorous experience by your own telling that you had. I'll let you read the book to find out about it.
Oh, cliffhanger.
No, just kidding. You can, if you want to share about that. Yeah.
Yes. So prayer, this was just a way that prayer has another beautiful function, or, there was a sister who had productive aphasia. So she could her communication, she had prosody, it basically sounded like moans. You couldn't understand the lexical items, the words she was saying. And Sister Irma invited her to bless me. And when I was in there, I thought, well, how the heck are you going to bless me? And, but she did. She placed her hand on my head and she moaned, and I mean, she blessed me. And I failed. I was the one who was communicatively incompetent because I said, amen, thank you, before she was done. I misunderstood a pause for the end. And she was the one in that interaction who was able to communicatively, and because it's communication with God directly, we were sharing in this really meaningful interaction, and it did not matter that I couldn't understand the words.
It's one of so many powerful and insightful anecdotes and narrations throughout the text. So thank you for that. Maybe just a couple more things, because I want to make sure we have time for feedback and comments from the in-person and virtual folks with us. As a male religious who shares a lot in common with my sisters in religious life, though a lot different as well, there are descriptions you use throughout your book that resonated very well with my own experience of life in a religious community. I particularly like this line early in the book, and I think my sisters in religious life will appreciate this. When you describe the significance of lifelong community living, you write, "We will see that this interdependence is not always easy. Embracing each other does not mean that the sisters always like each other." And you emphasize the like in italics. And I have to say to that, so true and amen. But I have to say that after the interesting research you present, the thing I was most fascinated by following that in your book was your own sharing of living among this community of women religious for months, multiple months, and you continue to be in relationship and communication with them. And spoiler alert, going to see them soon, God willing. And you signaled some of this, it clearly comes through in the book. You signaled some of this in your presentation, but the question I kept finding myself wanting to ask you, and this is my opportunity, what was that experience like for you?
I did not go into the convent expecting to be personally transformed by the experience, but I have to say it's been really a great blessing in my life. I have felt completely transformed by the experience, by the blessing. I don't know if any of the sisters are on the virtual thing, but it has really been a profound gift. And I think I went in, I'm Jewish. I went in with, I had very limited interactions with sisters before this. And I went in really naive. Like I remember packing like long sleeve shirts because I was, even though it was the summer when I first went, because I was not sure what this was going to be like and how, uptight, and good I had to be. And I was nervous and I was interested in this question, but I was curious, but I didn't expect personally for it to impact me. And I have to say it's almost hard to express how profoundly impacted I was by witnessing the love, the care, the interdependence, the mutual support in the convent. This line that you read is kind of a perfect one. I think in the secular world, we have so much this sense that our relationships should serve us and should be pleasant and that we should be friends. And so much so that often, we can even choose not to spend holidays with our families. We have chosen, and sometimes that's really important. There's trauma, there's all kinds of reasons. But there's this sense of finding your people and connecting with the people who are like you, and the sense of choice, but also this sense of, I don't know, that we can sort of hop around and change. And I realized being in the convent, how important it is to be with people who are difficult to be with. And I was not really practicing as a Jew when I went to the convent, and I was actually pregnant with my first when I was on that first trip in the convent. And I realized while I was in the convent, this is something I want for my kid. I want my kids to learn how to care for people that they don't like. And there's so much we can learn about, just that process of relationships not being about the ego, but being about everything else, humanity, being in service, putting yourself aside. There's so much more I could say, but I was so transformed by the experience.
I think that's a profound witness and very inspiring. I have one more question, but I just want to prompt, especially to our friends virtually, that we have our wonderful Center for Spirituality student assistant, Miss Ellie Gibney, who is going to be handling the questions as they come in. So please, if you have a comment or question for Dr. Corwin, please put that in the chat or in the Q&A button. But my last question, there is so much to say, and I'll leave it to the rest of the audience to follow up on things of interest. But I would be remiss. I love how you begin and end the book with, you shared a little bit about your daughter growing and noticing her height. You also end the book with reference to your children as well. And so the question I have, and you just mentioned them now, who have been through their whole lives, part of this process. What do your kids think about these sisters in Indiana? What do they know about them? How do they refer to them? And what part are they in their whole universe?
Well, my son Solomon spent some time as a baby in the convent, like was handed around to the sisters, and the sisters know my Solomon well. Luna has only visited a little bit. It's because it's so far away. They have not spent as much time as I wish they would. But in the imaginary, I mean, in relationship, I mean, Luna May just drew a picture, and I sent it to the convent, of sisters playing cards. So there's this way in which they are absolutely embedded in the imaginary of my children. And even just actually right before I left, Luna May, my daughter, she was like puzzling this out. And she was like, so sisters never have kids? And I said, yeah. And she said, so to get new sisters, new people have to join. And I said, yes. And she said, I want to do that. And I said, well, we're Jewish. There's no Jewish nuns. But she said, so will they arrest me if I join the convent? So, I mean, there's this way. I said, I promised her they won't, no one will arrest her. But other than Edith Stein, maybe she'll be the first Jewish nun. So just that shows kind of the tenderness and kind of warmth and connect, at least in the imaginary, that my children have.
That's so lovely. Are there questions or comments from folks here in the auditorium, maybe to begin? And raise your hand, and Ellie will follow up with a microphone.
Oh, I think.
Okay.
I think this is my friend who I haven't seen in many years, who was waving, I think.
I thought that was a question. We do have one here, though.
There's them.
The microphone's coming right behind you. Yeah, it's on its way here. Yeah. Very good. Thank you.
So one of the words that I haven't heard you use is countercultural. And I, as a nun, we are a countercultural group, especially in the United States. So, we live in community. We pool our financial resources. We ask for what we need, and we get it. We don't always get what we want. And I always use the example of how I know the difference is I really want a convertible, but I've chosen the wrong lifestyle for a convertible, okay? But and so when it comes to aging, we continue. I think you've been talking countercultural through the whole lecture, but I think to use the word, for me, pulls it together. This is not something that we do just when we're aging.
Absolutely.
Our whole lives
are
countercultural, presenting a different model with different values out of which you can live and be very, very happy.
Yes. I will just say amen to that. Absolutely. It's a lifelong process.
How inspiring your presentation is. As I was listening, it reminded me, I was thinking at the same time that how I'm experiencing being in the convent. I'm from Bangladesh, and most of our sisters are young. And here, when I came here, and I am experiencing with who are older than me, so how they are living. So your presentation is giving me awareness to be more aware that how our sisters are living here as age, and what I will take so that our sisters will learn from me that how to grow in age, And another thing, I was communicating in my mind. I was thinking that how my mom is growing in age. My mom is 77 now. So in our culture, we are more social oriented people. So my mom has a group, or when they grow in age, so they form a group in the nearby houses, you know. So they have sort of like recreation. They sing together, they pray together, they chat together. So that way they support each other. So we don't have now. Recently, it's growing the living homes. Practically, we don't have living homes. Our government and our people encourage that when a person grow in age, when the family will take care, because that person really cared for the family. So now it's the children or grandchildren has responsibility to care for this aged person, you know. But yeah, I'm very grateful and thank you. Your presentation is so well and inspiring.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for your reflection. So, you bring this to a global conversation. And I think this is really important and really interesting. This successful aging model that I talk about, this model in the US where older folks at the end of life are isolated, are stigmatized, are often in old age homes, separated from multi-generational communities. This model, which we sort of have come to think of as normal in the US, is a very unusual model. It's spreading around the world. Like you're mentioning, there's growing old age homes in India and Bangladesh, all over the world, in Japan, everywhere. Or not everywhere, but many places. And it's spreading, it's moving with industrialization and neoliberalism. So there's this movement. And so, but if we look, it's very, culturally, it's very unusual for, you speak about the sisters being countercultural, but it's really, really unusual for older adults to be separated from the family, separated from these intergenerational spaces and isolated. And it really is a product of and rides with capitalism, basically productivity, right? And I write in the book, for example, Sarah Lamb is an anthropologist who works in West Bengal, and she talks about aging, models of aging there that, of course, really contrast this American version that I described, the successful aging version. And I guess I won't go too much into it, but just to say that there is tremendous diversity around the world. And I think thinking about, especially as these moments of change, like you're describing, are happening, how do we take up these moments of change intentionally and think about personhood and value and an integration of older adults into meaningful communities like the ones that your mom has or the sisters have.
Any other questions or comments in the room or online? Oh, we have one over here.
Kind of continuing from where you were just speaking, I'm really curious about what, I guess, the completeness of this image of aging, because it seems like you're providing a lot of strategies for a very individual, like if you're not in a community like this, you have very individual tools of how personally to come to terms with that. But as you mentioned, the socio-political situation, the structure of how our society makes that so that it's very much an individual burden. And so I'm wondering if you have any ideas about reducing that so it is, obviously that's changing society, revolution, but any sort of ideas about that?
Yes, I think that's a wonderful question. And you precisely are naming essentially the problem of neoliberalism, this idea that these everything should rest on the individual. And that, of course, itself is a problem already because we do not exist as individual atoms. We are always entangled with each other. And I'm using these metaphors of entangle anyway. So yes, any kind of change must happen at both of these sites. It has to happen at the individual level and at the community level. The piece that gives me hopefulness is that it doesn't need to happen. I would love for President Biden to invite me over and to change infrastructure in the entire country. But it doesn't have to be that big. I do have hope for spaces where things can change at a smaller level. And I'll just give an example. I did a small I was curious about exactly this. What can we change just with the little tools that we have? And so I did this little study, or an intervention study. I went to this local retirement community, which is not Catholic. It's, and I was interested in whether we could change attitudes around aging with just a small 8-week intervention. And so I had about, I'm forgetting exactly, maybe 12 people in this community who volunteered to be part of the study. And we practiced, I think spiritual practice is really key. I don't think it needs to be Catholic or Jewish or any particular, it doesn't have to be a specific, but generally I think there's meaning making more generally can be important. And so we practice metta, loving kindness meditation. I taught them loving kindness meditation. And we practiced reframing the values around aging and the body. And just in community, that we met once a week for 8 weeks was really, really sort of easy compared to infrastructure changes. And what was amazing was that there were people reported changes. So the people in this group, through the 8 weeks in community, their attitudes around their own aging changed. And there was a transformation from this attitude of, I want to be as successful as I can. I'm going to avoid aging as long as I can, be as active as I can for as long as I can, and it's a subtle change, because I'm not saying you shouldn't be active, right? I'm not saying you shouldn't be productive if you want to be productive, but a change of where you're valuing yourself. And so moving one's idea of what makes me an okay, good, valuable human away from, I accomplished this thing, or I ran 5 miles, or my body doesn't hurt, into this space of, I have pain and that is what it is today. Just being rather than doing is the way I put it in the book. And I saw changes just over 8 weeks. And what is even more striking, and this is largely the community that happened to be there, but this group continues to meet. These people who happened to sign up for my intervention study are still meeting 2 years later, once a month, on their own. I mean, I show up when I can, but on their own, and they have created community. So they have created a pod of community, and one of them has dementia now and is working through that, and they are there for him, supporting him. And so that is, I think, an example that gives me a lot of hope that, yes, there's a lot of infrastructure we can change. And until we have the capital to do that, there's also little ways that we can come together in small pods and work on this together.
Any other comments or questions? Anything online? Well, maybe one last question then before we go. I always like to ask this. You're number 2, so I've done this 2 for 2. What has the reception been in particular? Have the sisters in this community given you any feedback now that the book is out?
Yes, this is, of course, was like the scariest, but also has been really rewarding. I've published a lot of this is academic too, but a lot of peer-reviewed sort of papers also. And I always give the community a chance to respond. So at least individuals within it to tell me what I got wrong, or even, all of that. Although there hasn't been much back and forth. They're usually very receptive, but this has been really positively received. It's one of the few things people are actually passing around and reading. The other stuff is a little more boring, maybe for non-academics. And, I had an incredibly gratifying moment where one of the sisters on the council, who now, of course, is part of her responsibilities is more formally visiting the sisters in the infirmary, told me that I should say, Sister Irma now is older and has dementia and is no longer doing some of the things that she was doing. Although I did get to witness, it was actually pretty incredible. I recently witnessed her using some of these strategies that I talk about in the book for herself. Like I witnessed her, it's kind of hard to explain, but I witnessed her almost reassuring her own self and making little jokes in her own moments of dementia and lapse. And so that was just amazing to witness. But this council member told me that she now is using some of these things that she's learned from Sister Irma through the book with her sisters now, in these same sisters, but in the ones who are older now in the infirmary. And so it's been a really good reception within the community, and I'm really grateful for that.
I'm so glad to hear it. And I'll add my my endorsement. If you haven't picked up already, I really love this book, and I think you will too. I encourage you to get a copy. And for those of you who are here physically, the campus bookstore has them available just outside the door of the auditoriums, where you can purchase a copy if you're so inclined. Before we bid farewell and extend a warm St. Mary's note of gratitude to you, Dr. Corwin, I want to just remind everybody that we still have some more events coming up this semester at the Center for Spirituality. March 24th is our annual Madaleva lecture. We are so delighted to have Professor Elizabeth Schulzer-Fiorenza of Harvard Divinity School, who will be joining us virtually for this year's Madaleva lecture. Registration is available online. And our last of the Ex Libris series for the semester is April 27th. So mark your calendars for that. And again, information online. So please join me in thanking Dr. Anna Corwin for this fantastic presentation and for an extraordinary book. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.